Read again, and this is our fourth week of meeting together to talk about the book of Daniel. If things look a little bit different on my screen, that's because I'm actually in Bologna, Italy right now. I arrived yesterday, and I'm here really for like a conference of people who are working on an encyclopedia of the Bible that is being put out by De Gruyter and Brill. And that'll be in Rome. But so I'm just here for a couple of days to enjoy myself in Italy before going to the conference. So in any event, for me it's about midnight, but I'm still on East Coast time, so I'm good. So my plan for today is I'll start by asking if there are any general questions about apocalyptic literature, which is really our topic for today. And we started talking about that last week. This is picking up on our conversations previous 3 weeks about the book of Daniel, and especially those diasporic parts of Daniel, the parts really about Daniel being in the court of a foreign king, and the three youth, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, being in the court of a foreign king and fighting to preserve their identity. And preserve their lives at the same time. And there's some tension that we see reoccurring in these stories about their faith in God that sets them apart as different and sets them up as targets and makes them vulnerable. So the question is, should they retain their faith in Yahweh, even if it makes them puts them at a disadvantage vis-a-vis their neighbors? The recurring answer in all of these stories is that God works in mysterious ways, that God works in ways that we can't quite understand or know or control, because God is the one who's fully in charge of the cosmos, in charge of history, in charge of all kings and powers. And if we find ourselves in difficult situations, the message is it is God who has put us there for a purpose. So the message is to keep your faith and also try to retain your identity as much as you can, but to make smart choices about what to give up and what to keep. And also to tell people about the God that is sovereign beyond all powers on this earth when we get the opportunity. Those are the recurring messages in Daniel chapters 1 through 6 that dovetail into the apocalyptic parts of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, that we started talking about last week. So my plan for tonight is to recap a little bit of what we talked about last week, that kind of introduction to apocalyptic literature. And we talked about chapter 8 last week. This week, my plan is to go back to chapter 7, which is a little more complicated, a little bit more difficult to interpret than chapter 8. Chapter 8 was kind of the easiest chapter to interpret in the second half of Daniel, and talk a little bit about these images that we see that really are very important for Christianity and are quoted in the New Testament, and to think about them in this context that chapter 7 of Daniel was written, but then also to think about why it was that these texts were so important and interesting to Jesus himself, who quotes Daniel chapter 7 in 3 of the 4 Gospels. So that's my idea for today. Try to help us see how apocalyptic literature like Daniel 7 is both strange, but also is a formative part of Jesus' own faith, and also is a formative part of early Christianity as a whole, and remains an important part of Christianity today. So I'll open us in prayer, and then I'll ask if there are any questions, and then I'll start to recap and catch us up. All right. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for today. We thank you for this season of Lent, for us to think about our relationship with you, to ask questions of ourselves and to ask questions of you too. This season of Lent that asks us for introspection and asks us to think about our commitments, how we are committed to you, and in what ways we are trying to grow. Gracious God, we ask that you be with us during this time. Help us to think about our own lives, our own relationship to you, our own relationships to our neighbors. And please help us to discern any wisdom that you might be trying to impart to us in the text of Daniel 7. Amen. All right. So let me just open with this question, which is, do you have any questions about what we talked about last time, either apocalyptic literature or Daniel chapter 8, or we talked about the Hellenistic period and Alexander the Great? We talked about the great persecution of the king Antiochus IV, who tried to eradicate the Jewish religion and how that led to apocalyptic literature. So, are there any questions or comments about any of that? And it's okay if there's not.
There don't appear to be any questions in the room here.
Great.
I don't see any hands raised from people. I think we've got 4 people viewing remotely as well. I don't see any hands raised, so.
Great. Okay, great. Well, feel free to chime in, and if folks watching online want to put something in the chat, feel free. So, I'll recap a bit about last time we talked about apocalyptic literature, and really that second half of the book of Daniel. So chapters 7 through 12 are the genre that we would call apocalyptic literature. And this is a really fascinating type of literature. It emerged at this time. Daniel chapter 7 is probably one of the first apocalyptic texts ever written. Jewish people invented this this type of text, this genre of literature, and it was adopted by other peoples later. So Egyptians later adopted this literature, made their own Egyptian apocalypses. Later, even Romans and stole some ideas from apocalyptic literature from the Jews. So that is to say, this was a very generative type of literature. But we think Jewish people invented this type of literature sometime around year 300 BC, and it sort of exploded into people's consciousness at the time of the persecution of Antiochus IV, the Greek king that tried to eradicate the Jewish religion in 167 BC. And he desecrated the temple. He killed people who had Torah scrolls. He killed people who circumcised their children. He really tried to eradicate the practices of Judaism and eradicate the ideas of Judaism. As I said last time, this was just a totally new, totally different thing. No one had ever in the history of the world that we know of, no one had ever tried to eradicate a religion. The ancient Egyptians, the ancient Mesopotamians, the ancient Canaanites, they all allowed people who lived around them, and even people that they conquered, they allowed them to have their own religious practices. And they never questioned whether or not other gods were real or whether they existed. They just thought their gods were the most powerful and so deserved the most praise. But the idea of telling people that they shouldn't practice a particular religion just was not an idea that people really considered in the ancient world until the year 167 BC. And the king of Antiochus IV, he ran into several problems with Jews refusing certain things that he really demanded. So his image being put in the temple. They refused his emissaries that tried to take money from the temple on a number of occasions. And he started to get very suspicious of them. And he said, well, Jews don't like using coins that have pictures of kings on them. Jews don't eat pigs. Jews don't like worshiping other gods. They won't allow you to say that their God is one of the Greek or Roman gods. So the Greeks and Romans like to look at other people's religions and say, your high god is basically the same as our Jupiter or our Zeus, right? They would make these equations between other people's gods and their gods. If you had an ocean god, they'd say, well, that's Neptune, right? Or whatever. Poseidon for the Romans. So they liked to identify their gods with other people's gods and try to map the pantheons onto each other. Well, the Jews didn't allow this. They didn't like the idea that their god was the same as Zeus. They refused it, in fact. So Antiochus IV got upset at Jews about a number of these things and began to think, well, what the problem with them is that their religion is actually the issue. What's interesting to me as a biblical interpreter who reads the book of Daniel is that you can start to see little inklings of this in some of those Babylonian administrators in chapters 1 through 6 of Daniel. The idea of persecuting a religion for its practices hadn't really existed yet, but you see in Daniel chapters, especially 3 and chapter 6, that there are people in the administration who are trying to persecute Daniel for his faith and persecute the 3 youth for their faith. So you can see these little inklings of religious persecution beginning to emerge, but really it's personal. It's not about trying to eradicate the whole religion. Well, fast forward to Antiochus IV in 167 BC. He starts to persecute the Jewish religion. People start to question whether or not Yahweh exists, whether or not Yahweh's powerful, whether or not Yahweh, we always demand for exclusivity, right? The God of Israel says, you have to only worship me. A lot of people said, should we do that? There's a really interesting book, Second Maccabees. The First and Second Maccabees are books that are canonical for Roman Catholics, but they're not canonical. They're not part of the Protestant Bible, but they're still interesting books. And if you read them, they don't go in a row. It's not like First and Second Kings, like they tell that the First and Second Kings or First and Second Samuel or First and Second Chronicles. They tell one story. The two books. First and Second Maccabees are totally different books written by totally different people. So they're not sequential, but they're two different perspectives on King Antiochus IV and his persecution. And Second Maccabees has some really interesting stories of like Jews beginning to wear togas. They're beginning to like wear, really the himation is what they was called, but like these kind of Greek dresses, the Greek hats. They started to train in gymnasium. They started to learn Greek language, and there are some people in Jerusalem that got really upset about this. But really, it was when Antiochus IV took over the temple and started to sacrifice pigs on in the Jewish temple, and he declared it a shrine to Zeus Olympios, Zeus who lives on the mountain Olympus, and that was the last straw, really, for a lot of Jews, and so they started to revolt in a way. And this is when Antiochus IV began to persecute the entire religion, tried to eradicate Judaism. So in that context, you can start to see why people might think something changed, something happened here. Jews before this time had really argued very strongly that God does everything. There's only one God. And because there's only one God, God is the cause of all things. And so Job says, the Lord gives, the Lord takes, blessed be the name of the Lord. Well, in Daniel chapter 7, for the first time in the history of Judaism, we see a different argument being made. And that argument is this is so evil, this is so bad, that we can't attribute this to God. We could attribute the exile to God because we could understand it to be either like the book of Kings says, a punishment for our sins, or we can understand it like Daniel 1 says, that this was God's attempts to try to scatter us among the nations so that we bring the word of God to all the peoples of the earth. Those are different ways to understand that tragedy. But the tragedy of the persecution of Antiochus IV was the persecution of the religion itself. Like the religion was being practiced well, and then it was persecuted and people died for it. And religious thinkers, really, the Jewish theologians were thinking, this doesn't make any sense. This can't possibly be. God could not do this. God could not kill people for being faithful. That doesn't make any sense to them. And it's at this point that they started to think, well, then who did this? This isn't just a man who's able to take over the temple and get rid of the sacrifices in the temple. If God wanted those to be there, then God would support that, right? So they said, well, who is it that's doing this? They said it must be more than just a person. I mean, this guy didn't just get this idea from being a person. He must have gotten it from an evil power. And this is the first time in the Old Testament that there's this really deep thought about something like an enemy of God that is spiritual. There's some sort of spiritual warfare happening, and it's no constant. I mean, it's no you know it makes sense that this is also the book of Daniel is the first time that we see spiritual warfare actually described, like angels fighting each other. We'll get to that next week. But all to say that this kind of apocalyptic mindset, this idea that God is allowing a time of crisis to emerge and is giving some ground in a way to an evil power, but that God is going to return suddenly, and God is going to set the world right, and God is going to judge the world, and God is going to judge this evil power and the people who have supported it. That there's some kind of cosmic justice that's about to come, and after that cosmic justice, everything will change. And while Daniel 7 doesn't say this, and Daniel 8 doesn't say it, Daniel 12 actually ends up saying, for the first time in Jewish history, what about those people who died and were faithful? Up to this point in Jewish history, death was a natural fact. Everyone died at some point. And there were two ways to die. You died happy or you died sad. If you died happy, then your family was okay and you felt at peace with your community and you felt at peace with God and you were old and full of days is the way that the Bible says it. You lived a good life and you died well. And you go down to the grave happy. That's the way they put it in the Bible. And you can sort of, there's this like kind of low level of existence that continued after life, but it wasn't really a life. It wasn't life anymore. Well, Daniel 12 says, what about those people who have been faithful and who've died for their faith? That doesn't make any sense to us. They didn't die for their sins. They died because of their faith in God. Faith in God is supposed to give you a long and happy life. That's the point of it. That's at least what a lot of people would have said back then. Well, so Daniel 12 ends up for the first time ever discussing resurrection, the return to life of people who have died as some sort of blessing or a reward for righteousness. We'll get to that next week as well. But just to say, there are a lot of new ideas that we take for granted when we read the Bible, actually really only emerge at the end of the Old Testament period after the year 167 in relation to this very intense attack on the Jewish faith. So if we take all that, if we think about all that, and let me return to chapter 7. So I'm going to turn to Daniel chapter 7. I'm going to read through it and explain, kind of explain pieces of it. And I think it'll give us a sense, with that background, of why this text is so strange, but also what it's trying to say. So you're gonna hear a lot of stuff in here that is very familiar, I'm sure. So in the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, so this is like back in chapter 5 of Daniel. So this is like between chapters 4 and 5 of Daniel. So is where this is. So Daniel's just hanging out in the castle. Well, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. So God sends visions. So chapters 7 through 12 of Daniel are all visions, whereas chapters 1 through 6 are all stories about stuff that happened. So he says, I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. So Daniel sees this dream. He writes it down. And what we're reading is Daniel's writing that he wrote down about the dream. He says, I saw in my vision of the night four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. So there's a great sea. So the story starts like Daniel's going to tell a little story of this vision here. It starts with a sea, and there's just one big sea that's there is. And the four winds of heaven, so north, south, east, west, right? So we get this kind of scene. The only other time in the Bible we see there's a description of the world being one big ocean is Genesis 1, the creation story. One thing that's really important about these apocalyptic stories, the stories about the end of the world, again, which only start to show up here at the time of Daniel chapter 7 through 12, they all also talk about the beginning. So the beginning and the end are always tied up, right? Beginnings and endings. So here in order to talk about the end of time, they go back to the beginning. And in the beginning, there's this massive sea. So in the beginning, God's spirit was hovering over the deep in Genesis 1. And here we get God, these four winds of heaven that are stirring up the great sea. And then these four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The sea is often a symbol of chaos in the ancient world and in the Bible. And here, these empires, these four great beasts that represent the four great kingdoms of the world, actually emerge out of ocean, this chaotic water. And the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. So the first of these world kingdoms. And as I watched, its wings were being plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. And then another beast appeared. So that first beast is a lion that has eagle's wings, and the wings get plucked off, and it gets a human brain. It's very strange. This reminds me, though, of Daniel's story in chapter 4. So Daniel chapter 4 is about Nebuchadnezzar turning into an animal and then having his mind restored to him. The interesting thing here for me is this is pretty clearly describing the kingdom of Babylon. So the lion was a great symbol of the kingdom of Babylon. They were called the lion. The state seal of Babylon was the king adding the lion. The on the walls of the great palace, sorry, the great entrance gate, the Marduk gate, they called it, the great gate into Babylon, where Jewish exiles would have been ceremonially processed in. The symbols on that wall, on those walls and towers were all lions. There were a couple other creatures on there as well, but there were a lot of lions significantly. So it's a real important symbol for Babylon. And it looks like this kind of animal is being transformed into a human. It looks a lot like Nebuchadnezzar to me. The idea here is that these are monsters coming out of the chaotic ocean. And these kind of cosmic monsters really are the empires that dominate the world. This is an answer, or an attempted answer, at the big question of why does God allow these foreign empires to dominate God's people? A lot of people throughout history have thought, well, if God is the true God, we are doing what God wants, and we're God's people, we should probably have a lot of power because God has a lot of power. We're following God. We should have a lot of power. And the book of Daniel responds, and much of the Bible responds to the strange fact that actually God doesn't choose the powerful, right? All the way back to Abraham and Sarah, who were not powerful people. God chose them because they were faithful, not because they were powerful. So this disconnect, right? This assumption that God should be with the powerful or for the powerful, but in fact, God usually is working in very strange and even foolish ways, as Paul said in the Gospels. Would Jesus think Jesus is a crucified criminal, an publicly executed state criminal? How could God possibly be working through this guy? But that's how God works. God works through these unpretentious people, that is to say. These chaotic beasts, that the powers of the world are actually not necessarily on God's side. But there's this sense here that God is in some way allowing it, that God is allowing these chaotic beasts to seize power, that God's truly the one in charge. But God being in charge sometimes means God removing the divine hands and allowing these processes that exist on earth to continue to exist. So this first beast becomes a human or whatever. This Nebuchadnezzar regains his mind and actually recognizes Yahweh as being powerful. But then another beast, pretty soon after Nebuchadnezzar, uh, the Persians and the Medes came in and destroyed Babylon. Well, they conquered Babylon and they destroyed the Babylonian Empire. So it says another beast appeared, a second one, looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side, had three tusks in its mouth among its teeth, and it was told, "Arise, devour many bodies." After this, as I watched, another appeared like a leopard. The beast had four wings of a bird on its back and four heads, and dominion was given to it. So God isn't mentioned here, but dominion was given. It's a passive verb, kind of a tricky way to imply that God is working, but in mysterious ways. So God has given dominion to this animal. And then I saw visions by night, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it and had 10 horns. So the succession of powers here, according to well, this is kind of putting together everything from Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8, and then Daniel chapters 10 through 12 talk about this as well, this succession of empires. Daniel chapter 2 has a bit of this in it too. And it seems to be that they've had this like progression that goes like the Babylonians, then the Medes, then the Persians. So the Medes, or the Median Empire, was actually the second empire listed here in Daniel chapter 7. They didn't conquer Babylon themselves, but they were a giant empire that coexisted with Babylon. And then the third kingdom is the Persians. The Persians actually get the Medes on their side, and they both attack Babylon. And so they're the third animal. And then the fourth animal is the Greeks, starting with Alexander the Great. So this exceedingly strong animal with iron teeth. This is like the hoplite formations. This is like Alexander the Great's Greek formations of these big shields and so on. That was undefeatable from anyone that he attacked. So he's devouring the world, breaking it in pieces and stamping it. And he says that this was different from all the beasts before it. So these Greek kingdoms were stronger and different. And then it says, and It had 10 horns. And this might be Alexander's like generals. So Alexander's generals that took over these parts of his empire after he died. Um, this might be just a roundabout number. You know, there's a bunch of kingdoms that pop up after Alexander the Great died. And then I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little horn that came up among them. Three of the original horns were plucked up before it. There were eyes like a human eye in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. So we saw this in chapter 8 as well. This is Antiochus the Fourth, that guy who was persecuting the Jewish faith. So he is this little horn that speaks arrogantly, coming up out of this beast. So this is the culmination of these four animals, these four great beasts that come and dominate the earth, these four kingdoms that God has allowed to have power. Um, but they are not. They are not representing God. So we might look at this point and say, oh no, like God has let the world go to pieces. But then we break into a poem. A song starts in verse 9. And Daniel sings, as I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. So the Ancient of Days, that's this right here. The Ancient One, or the Ancient of Days, took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. You might have heard this from Revelation chapter 1, the description of God there. This is borrowed directly from Daniel 7. Daniel 7 is really borrowing this from Ezekiel chapter 1 and 2, actually, as well. So this is kind of a tradition of how to describe God's appearance. God's throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. Why does God's throne have wheels? Well, it's the Ark of the Covenant, which was imagined by Ezekiel to have grown wheels so it could move on its own. It didn't have to be carried by the people anymore, so that it could go to the people in exile. Remember the wheels within wheels, Ezekiel's wheels within wheels? That's Ezekiel chapter 1. And what that really is a vision of God's presence. It's able to move on its own power, like one of those new self-automated cars, like one of those Teslas or that can drive itself. Like it's a self-automated car that just goes wherever the people are. That is to say, God doesn't need you to be in Jerusalem. God can follow you wherever you are in exile. So here, we see this image of the wheels within wheels and God's presence or whatever. And it's imagined here, like returning to earth. The scene here, it really is this admission that God has left the earth, like God abandoned the earth for a little bit. But God has returned. In verse 9, God returns. The thrones are set up. Why was God's throne not set up? God had like dismantled it in a way. We're not told why. It doesn't seem to be a judgment for sin here. It just God had, for God's own unspoken reasons, allowed the world to a state of chaos for a time. But God's judgment is coming. God's going to rule the world again with justice. So God's wheels of burning fire, the Ark of the Covenant shows back up. And then it says, a stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. And 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. And the courts sat in judgment, and the books were opened. What books? The books that have the names of the righteous in it. If you kind of kept the faith, right? And the names of the people who are going to need some talking to. That's like Antiochus the Fourth, right? God's got the books that have all of the justice in it. What should happen. So verse 11, Daniel says, I've watched then because of that noise of that arrogant words that horn was speaking. So this is right at the time of Antiochus the Fourth, during that persecution. And as I watched, the beast was put to death. It doesn't say by who, but God, anyway, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So there's a recognition here that God has allowed these kingdoms to exist, but they've already been judged. As I watched in the night visions, Daniel says, I saw one like a human being, or an older translation would be one like the Son of Man. This is where when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, he's quoting Daniel chapter. So Daniel 7 says, I saw one like the Son of Man. And really that phrase, Son of Man, really means human being or mortal one, somebody who is born of a woman, right? That's the son of a human, right? A human person. So that phrase actually doesn't start in Daniel 7. That phrase was originated by Ezekiel. Remember I told you that Daniel was borrowing the wheels within wheels from Ezekiel? Well, he borrows the Son of Man phrase too. Son of Man first shows up in Ezekiel chapter 1, and Ezekiel uses it to say, I am just a mortal or a son of man. It's often translated now as mortal in the book of Ezekiel, like in the NRSV. Oh, mortal, will these bones live? What that literally says is, oh, son of man, will these bones live? So the point is that Ezekiel is receiving God's word, but Ezekiel's not special. He's just a regular mortal like everyone else, right? Ezekiel's just a person. And so the point here is that Daniel looks up and he sees one like a human being or one like the Son of Man. What he means is he looks up and he sees a regular guy. That's the point. That's what this means. It means I looked up at the clouds and I saw a guy, just a guy. Like, I mean, Bob, I saw Brennan, like just random guy coming with the clouds of heaven, like riding the clouds of heaven down. Now, I mean, it's supposed to be a little bit funny, even. Like you're supposed to look up and see like, some incredible, like, I mean, the description of God above was like, the hair of his head's like pure wool, and his clothing's white as snow, and his throne is fiery flames, and streams of fire are shooting out of him. That's just a couple verses ago, right? So, like, that's what God looks like. But Daniel looks up at the sky to see judgment coming on this persecution, and he looks up and he sees the clouds open, and he sees like random guy come floating down the clouds, not fire monster, right? So it's supposed to be ironic or it's supposed to be confusing. I saw this regular guy coming, and then he came to the ancient one or the ancient of days. That's God. That's like what they understood to be God, and was presented before him. And then to this guy, random guy, was given dominion and glory and kingship, so that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. And that goes back to that use of peoples, nations, and languages in Daniel 3 that I mentioned. That it was so important that the kings thought that they ruled the whole world, they ruled all the peoples of the world. It's really important to them. But this random guy, not special, doesn't look special at all to anyone who sees him, is given all this authority that Nebuchadnezzar desperately wanted and could not get. His dominion, this guy's sovereignty, his rule is an everlasting dominion or an everlasting sovereignty, shall not pass away. And his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. So random guy is going to be given the throne. As for me, Daniel says in verse 15, my spirit was troubled. So that's the end of the vision. And he doesn't get it. He needs help. So he says, I approached one of the attendants, that is one of the angels, and I asked him the truth about this. So Daniel's like, hey, you're a scary angel, but still, can you help me understand this? So he said that he would disclose the interpretation of the matter. So this angel is going to interpret this for Daniel. That's what makes this an apocalypse. The word apocalypse means revelation. So this is a revelation, really an explanation of what's happening in the world through these mysterious symbols and signs, but they get interpreted in the story. So the angel says, as for these four great beasts, four kings shall arise out of the earth. Okay, these are the four kingdoms that we just talked about. But the holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. So the end of the story, according to this angel, is that the holy ones of the Most High. Now that means the faithful, the ones who have been faithful to God through all of this crisis, the ones who have not given up their faith, the ones who have not recanted, and the ones who have retained their faith even despite appearances. They're the ones that will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. I can show you this again because the story gets interpreted yet again. Daniel basically asks another angel, and an angel tells him the same thing, basically, gives him a little bit more detail. But in the story, like the original hearers of Daniel 7, the first time they heard it, they would have thought that, and verse 18 says, this is about the faithful who were living in Jerusalem in the year 167 BC. They are the son of man, or the human being. That's how they would have understood it themselves. And I'll show you this by reading a little bit more. I'm not saying it's not Jesus. I do think it's Jesus, but we'll get there. We'll get there. So verse 19. So Daniel is not satisfied with this interpretation, this quick easy interpretation you got for this angel. He wants more. He said, "Then I desired to know the truth concerning the fourth beast, which was just different than all the rest, and had all those horns and stuff, and was exceedingly terrifying. It had those teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and it broke stuff. I wanted to know about those horns, and especially that horn that had an arrogant mouth and that seemed greater than the others." And then verse 21, as I looked, so Daniel's like seeing the vision again in his head. He's remembering it. As I looked, like as I remembered this vision, that horn made war with the holy ones and was prevailing over them. It's like killing followers of God until the ancient one came. So that is God's return to earth. Actually, is the thing that restores order here and starts to bring justice. And the judgment was given for the holy ones of the Most High, and the time arrived when the holy ones gained possession of the kingdom. So yet again, we see that it's the people who are being persecuted who will receive power in some way. And this is what the angel said. As for the fourth beast, we're going to get another interpretation here. There shall be a fourth kingdom on earth. It shall be different from all the other kingdoms. It's going to devour and have 10 horns, and it's repeated. It's going to be different from those other previous empires. And this one guy, verse 25, shall speak words against the Most High and shall wear out the holy ones of the Most High. And he will even change the ritual calendar and the law. So he's going to try to get rid of the Torah or the law, the Torah, right? He's going to try to burn the Bible, and he's going to get rid of the rituals. He's going to stop them being able to sacrifice. He's going to change the religion, and they shall be given into his power. And then it says, for a time, 2 times, and half a time. The way this is often interpreted, based on other parts of the book of Daniel as well, is that this means a year, 2 years, and then half a year. You add that all up, you get 3.5 years, which is actually the amount of time that it was between the beginning of the persecution of Antiochus IV and the restoration of the temple, or Hanukkah, when the Jewish army of the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, Judas Maccabeus, reconquered Jerusalem and reinstituted the temple and rededicated the temple. So it was 3.5 years, the real crisis. And here Daniel says it's going to be a time, 2 times, and half. So we'll get to other predictions in the book of Daniel as well, and there's a bit of squishiness with the time, but they all say somewhere around 3.5 years. So all the same, this is probably the prediction part. They probably were predicting be about 3.5 years. Then the court shall sit in judgment. So God's court will judge at that point. And his dominion shall be taken away to be consumed and totally destroyed. And the kingship and dominion and the greatness of all these kingdoms under heaven. So all that sovereignty that seems to be held by the powers of the world shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. Verse 27 is very clear. It's the people who have been faithful in Jerusalem through all of this crisis. They're going to receive, they are the Son of Man, the mortal ones. And when Daniel 7 was written, this was understood to be referring to the fact that, like, these random looking people, right? The faithful ones didn't look strong. They didn't look powerful. They looked weak, and it looked foolish to anyone to put faith in the fact that these people were going to survive. They were setting themselves up for destruction by continuing to practice their religion in the face of the most powerful king on earth who had decided to eradicate them. However, they ended up surviving, and the temple was rededicated. This must have been an unspeakable reversal, right? These people who did not seem powerful ended up being able to rededicate their temple and continue to worship God. I think that is really this message of Daniel 7. And it doesn't talk about heaven or the end of time. We'll get to that next week. But chapter 7, and we read chapter 8 last week, neither of them mention kind of like the end of all time, but they're really talking about this moment of crisis in 167 to 164 BC. As I said, next time we're going to get to that question about is like the end of all time and the end of everything and what comes after that. That's addressed in Daniel chapter 12. But the whole point of today is to say, when Jesus is quoting Daniel 7, Jesus calls himself Son of Man all the time, and he's referring to this. But then he also, when he's on trial, he says, well, the clouds will come, open up, and the Son of Man will come down, and he's referring to himself. So he's quoting Daniel 7. That's clearly a quotation of Daniel 7 during his trial, right for his execution. And so this is a really important part of Jesus's claim of who he is. And I think it makes a lot of sense if we hear Daniel 7 talking about the fact that there's injustice on earth that seems to completely disrespect God and God's authority and persecutes the very people who put their faith in God and who love God. And this seems to create a massive tension for people who follow God and are risking their lives for that very fact. But then also there's a persecution of the religion, like the actual religions being persecuted. In Jesus's day, there were several attempts by Rome, by several emperors, but also by Pilate himself, to put the Roman standard in the temple. Jews fought against this and even tried to sacrifice their own lives to try to fight back and retain their sovereignty over the temple and keep the Roman worship of the emperor cult out of the temple. And there are a bunch of other conflicts as well. But Rome was slowly strangling the religion of the people, and Jesus was someone who ends up being persecuted to the point of death by the Roman Empire for his faith. When Jesus says, "Hey, you're gonna look up and the clouds are gonna open, and the Son of Man," Jesus has been talking about himself as the Son of Man. They all knew that is going to come out of these clouds. What he really is saying, everyone would have understood at the time. He's saying, you know how unexpected it was in 167 BC for these people to be able to rise up again after being persecuted by Antiochus IV? Well, you know what? You're going to kill me, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to be that Son of Man, that mortal, the unexpected, who comes down from the clouds and actually presides over justice and judgment and salvation, and ends up receiving this kingship and dominion for all peoples, nations, and languages. I mean, this really is like Jesus's message, like all wrapped up. Nobody in the year 164 would have understood what Jesus was talking about. But in Jesus's day, Daniel chapter 7 makes a ton of sense and actually ends up being almost like a key that unlocks how he thought about himself and how he was trying to express himself to the authorities, both Roman authorities and Jewish authorities. He was saying, "I am the one that is weak, that is going to be even executed by the state, and my weakness will end up being the very reason that I end up being exalted, given power and authority and dominion." That brings us to resurrection, which we're going to get to next week in Daniel chapter. Questions, comments, concerns?
Any questions here in the room, or if anybody online has a question, raise your hand or put it up in the chat. Yes, got a question here?
Seems
Great.
as though over and over again,
Yeah.
people see a vision and somehow some part of it is fulfilled.
Yes.
We can't help but wonder what in the world the message is to us when over and over again, preachers and evangelists have said, this is how it's going to happen, this is what's going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
And what is the message to us when we have reason to be very skeptical about it?
That's a great point. That's a great point. Yeah, and I think many people see like the prediction part of Daniel, like it's going to be 3.5 years. They see that and they think, okay, there's a secret in here, and I'll decode it. Next week, we're going to talk more about this, because the texts that most people use to try to like do the whole deciphering and predicting thing that has gone so wrong throughout history. Typically, those people are looking at Daniel chapter 9 and Daniel chapter 12. And so I'll talk about both of those next week. But there's a whole series, I mean, thousands of these predictions that have come one after another, where people are trying to interpret the book of Daniel and figure out what day it's trying to say. Jesus himself says, right, the Son of Man is going to come like a thief in the night. No one will know the day or time. Right? Don't try to predict this stuff. That is to say, no one's going to figure it out. But really smart people have. I mean, Isaac Newton, the whole second half of Isaac Newton's career, he spent trying to interpret the book of Daniel to try to figure out what day was going to be the end of the world. And he literally went through this. I'm going to show you a graphic next time of like the history of the world that he thought he had put together to try to figure out what day it was going to happen. And he's not the only one. I mean, lots of smart people have tried to do this. But I really do think that the message of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, is not there's a calculation that will get you to figure out the day that Jesus is going to come back. I think instead the message is a much broader one, and that message is that God is sovereign over the whole universe, even when it doesn't seem like it, and maybe even especially when it doesn't seem like it, and that God continues to work through and to bless people who don't expect it and people who the world doesn't expect. So God chooses the murderer Moses, who is living out in the wilderness, right, to be the one who's going to go set the people free. God chooses Abraham and Sarah, an unsuspecting couple who are childless, to be the people who bear the people of the promise. God chooses Jesus, this carpenter's son, born in strange circumstances. I'm sure a lot of people talked about Mary's condition, and maybe Joseph wasn't the father. There were we can talk about Peter and Paul again, all these unsuspecting people. No one would have pinned them as being the ones who are going to change the world, and yet God worked through them to do just that. So I think the message of Daniel is not there's a day and a time, and it's your job to figure it out. Everything in the book of Daniel that is like truth gets communicated mysteriously by God, and Daniel can't ever figure it out himself. So we're not going to figure it out. But the basic message we can figure out, and that is God is sovereign, even when it doesn't look like it in the world. And God works through people who are humble and people who are unsuspecting, but who are faithful. That is to say that the faith of us and our neighbors, and our friends, our faith that God is with us and that God will be with us is actually the kind of motor or engine or power that sustains us even through the hardest of times. So I think that's the bigger message. And in terms of being skeptical, I'm super skeptical of anyone who would say, I mean, I'm not even just skeptical. I just flat out reject anyone who would say that a day or a time picked out. Does that help at all?
Okay, there we go.
One quick follow-up on that. You can't help but wonder when someone is telling you about a vision that he had and then pairing it with historical events. You wonder whether he wrote down that vision before the events happened or afterwards.
It's a great question. And I think, I mean, just to be honest, like looking at this, like as a historian, using the tools of history, we would say, yeah, the historical person of Daniel probably didn't initially write these visions. How do I know that? I mean, just looking at the I mean, especially when we look at chapter 11, which we'll do next week, the very specific descriptions of the history of these Greek empires, which is just written. I mean, the person who wrote Daniel 11 had access to a literal Greek history, like a history of the Greek empires that followed Alexander the Great. And they were like rewriting it in code. How do we know that? Because we have some Greek historians from that time, and it's exactly the same plot, and everything's the same. Can God, whatever, you get put all that in someone's head. It's possible, sure, but not likely. I don't think God works exactly that way. So I do think that most of Daniel 7 through 12 was written at the time of this persecution of Antiochus IV. So in 167 BC. And I think a lot of it is retrojecting this history as if it's a vision. We can think like that's like a trickery or kind of a lie or something. I really don't think that people in 167 BC were thinking that way. All the scribes knew each other. Whoever wrote this It's anonymous. It's in the name of Daniel, but it's written anonymously. But whoever wrote this had a bunch of friends that thought similarly. But they knew that writing in the name of an ancient person was a expected and well practiced literary technique. It wasn't trickery or deceit. But we can say, even just using the tools of history, this is not like a theological claim, like all historians would agree, that Daniel 7 through 12 wasn't completely written after the fact. That is to say that 167 BC was the beginning of this persecution, and 164 was the end. And we know that the whole thing was not written after 164, all in retrospect. How do we know that? Because several times the book of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12, makes claims about what's going to happen at the end of this 3.5 years. So that chapters 7 and 8 are the two that we've looked at so far. The end of both of those basically just says, after the end of 3.5 years, God's going to fix it. As we'll see, chapters 9 and 11 and 12 make more specific claims about what's going to happen at the end of the 3.5 years, and they get it a bit wrong. They don't get it totally wrong. Overall, it's right, but there are these details that they get wrong about what's going to happen. So they nail the history up until 164 BC, or really until like 165 BC. So what we'd say is we think the historians, not just religious folks, but historians think that Daniel chapter 7 through 12 was written about 164 because these predictions that they make, they get right in large kind of outline, but a lot of the specifics they start to get wrong. We'll talk about those next week as well. But all to say that there is a predictive element to Daniel chapter 7 through 12. It's just not as much of a prediction as many Christians have been led to believe. I don't know if that helps, but that's at least how most scholars imagine it.
Thank you, it does help.
Yeah, we'll get more into that next week.
Brennan, thank you so much. Thank you for staying awake to talk to us.
Well, yeah. Hopefully I get some sleep tonight. But it was great to talk to y'all, and I'll look forward to seeing you next Wednesday.
Yes,
And we look forward to hearing about your travels and the things that you've seen.
yes.
Indeed, it's going to be fun. I'm really looking forward to it. Peace, y'all.
Okay. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Italy. Last time I asked.
Yeah.
Yeah.